We're watching something dangerous unfold right before our eyes, and the mainstream media isn't telling you the real story. The Trump administration has just made a calculated move against Iran that could reshape the entire Middle East, and most Americans have no idea what's actually at stake here. This isn't about democracy or human rights, despite what you'll hear on cable news. This is about control of energy corridors, control of regional power structures, and control of the narrative that keeps the American public supporting policies that don't serve their interests. Iran has been in the crosshairs for decades, not because of any genuine threat to American citizens, but because it refuses to bend to Western financial hegemony. The sanctions, the provocations, the coordinated media demonization, these are tools of economic warfare that have been used time and again. But here's what's different now. Iran isn't isolated anymore. Russia and China have drawn their lines in the sand. So when Trump provokes Iran, he's not just rattling sabers at Tehran, he's testing the resolve of a multipolar world order that refuses to accept American unilateral dominance. This could spiral into something none of us are prepared for. Let me be very clear about what's happening here, because if you're relying on CNN or Fox News or any of the establishment outlets to explain this situation, you're getting a carefully sanitized version of events that serves very specific interests. The Trump administration's latest moves against Iran aren't spontaneous reactions to some imminent threat. They are deliberate escalations in a decades-long strategy to bring Iran to its knees, and understanding why this matters requires us to look beyond the surface-level narratives about terrorism and nuclear weapons that get repeated endlessly on television. Iran has been a target of Western imperial ambitions since 1953, when the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because Mossadegh had the audacity to nationalize Iran's oil industry, taking control of resources that British and American companies believed belonged to them. That coup installed the Shah, a brutal dictator who served Western interests faithfully until the Iranian Revolution of 1979 threw him out. Ever since then, Iran has been portrayed as the ultimate villain in the Middle East, the source of all instability, the sponsor of terrorism, the existential threat that justifies massive military budgets and endless interventions. But here's what they don't tell you. Iran's real crime isn't terrorism or nuclear ambitions. Its real crime is independence. Think about the geography for a moment. Iran sits at one of the most strategically vital locations on the planet. It controls the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. It borders the Caspian Sea to the north, Afghanistan and Pakistan to the east, Iraq to the west, and has significant influence throughout the Persian Gulf. This isn't just another country in the Middle East. This is a major regional power with substantial resources, an educated population of over 80 million people, and a demonstrated ability to project influence across borders through its network of allied militias and political movements. For anyone trying to maintain hegemonic control over the Middle East and its energy resources, Iran represents a massive obstacle. Now let's talk about what Trump has actually done recently that constitutes this provocation. We're seeing a return to maximum pressure tactics that go beyond even what we saw during his first term. The administration has reimposed crippling sanctions that target not just Iran's government, but its entire economy. These sanctions prevent Iran from selling its oil on international markets, freeze its assets in foreign banks, and cut it off from the global financial system. The human cost of these sanctions is staggering. We're talking about ordinary Iranians who can't get life-saving medications, who face skyrocketing inflation that destroys their savings, who watch their currency become worthless. This is economic warfare, plain and simple, and it's designed to create so much suffering that the population rises up and overthrows their government. But sanctions are just one piece of the puzzle. Trump has also greenlit aggressive military posturing in the region. We've seen increased naval deployments in the Persian Gulf, expanded military cooperation with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and intelligence sharing arrangements specifically designed to counter Iranian influence. There have been reports of covert operations, cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, and support for separatist movements inside Iran's borders. All of this is happening while Trump and his advisors use increasingly bellicose rhetoric threatening military action if Iran crosses various red lines that seem to shift depending on the day of the week. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the context in which it's happening. Trump isn't operating in the same unipolar world that existed when his father's generation was making foreign policy decisions. The world has changed fundamentally in the last 2 decades, and the people running American foreign policy seem either unwilling or unable to accept this reality. China has emerged as a peer competitor economically and increasingly militarily. Russia has rebuilt its military capabilities and demonstrated its willingness to use them when its core interests are threatened. Together, these two powers have made it clear that they will not stand by and watch the United States redraw the map of the Middle East according to its preferences. Iran has been building closer ties with both Russia and China for years now, and these aren't just diplomatic pleasantries or symbolic gestures. We're talking about serious economic partnerships, military cooperation agreements, and strategic coordination that fundamentally changes the calculus of any potential conflict. China needs Iranian oil to fuel its economy. It has invested billions in Iranian infrastructure as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia sees Iran as a crucial ally in maintaining its own influence in the Middle East and preventing the region from becoming a Western-controlled sphere. Both countries have made substantial commitments to Iran that they cannot simply walk away from without losing credibility on the global stage. This is why the current situation is so much more dangerous than previous escalations. When the United States bombed Iraq in 2003, Russia and China protested but ultimately did nothing to stop it. Iraq was isolated, weakened by years of sanctions, and had no major power willing to come to its defense. Iran is in a completely different position. Any American attack on Iran would force Russia and China to make very difficult choices about how to respond. Do they provide Iran with advanced air defense systems? Do they share intelligence about American military movements? Do they impose economic consequences on the United States? Do they take more direct action? These are questions that could escalate a regional conflict into something much larger and more catastrophic. Let me address the nuclear issue because this gets brought up constantly as justification for aggressive policies toward Iran. Yes, Iran has a nuclear program. Yes, there are legitimate questions about its ultimate intentions, but let's inject some reality into this discussion. Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It allowed international inspectors access to its facilities. It negotiated in good faith to reach the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, an agreement that placed strict limits on its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. And what happened? Trump unilaterally withdrew from that agreement in 2018. Even though Iran was in full compliance according to international inspectors, he withdrew because the deal didn't address Iran's missile program or its regional activities, issues that were never part of the negotiations in the first place. Think about this from Iran's perspective for just a moment. You negotiate an agreement with the world's most powerful country and several other major powers. You comply with every requirement. You submit to intrusive inspections. And then a new administration comes in and tears up the agreement, reimposes sanctions, and demands even more concessions. What message does that send? It tells Iran that agreements with the United States are worthless, that compliance gains you nothing, and that the only language Washington understands is strength and deterrence. Is it any wonder that Iran has since expanded its nuclear program, enriching uranium to higher levels and installing more advanced centrifuges? They learned the lesson that Libya learned when Gaddafi gave up his weapons programs and was then overthrown with Western support. They learned the lesson that Iraq learned when it actually didn't have weapons of mass destruction but was invaded anyway. The real issue here isn't whether Iran might develop a nuclear weapon at some point in the future. The real issue is that Iran refuses to subordinate its foreign policy to American preferences. It supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the only force that has successfully resisted Israeli military operations in the region. It supports the Assad government in Syria, preventing the country from being carved up by Western-backed rebels. It supports the Houthi movement in Yemen, which is fighting against a Saudi-led coalition that has created one of the worst humanitarian disasters on the planet. You can disagree with Iranian foreign policy, you can find their government reprehensible, but you have to understand that from their perspective, they're defending their interests and their allies in a region where the United States and its partners have launched multiple wars of aggression over the past 2 decades. Now, I want to talk about what war with Iran would actually look like, because there seems to be a dangerous lack of imagination in Washington about the consequences of military action. This wouldn't be a repeat of the invasions of Afghanistan or Iraq. Iran has a sophisticated military with significant defensive capabilities. It has ballistic missiles that can reach every American military base in the Middle East, every allied capital, and every oil installation in the Persian Gulf. It has drones and cruise missiles that have proven capable of striking targets with remarkable precision, as we saw when Iranian-backed forces attacked Saudi oil facilities in 2019, temporarily taking out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity. It has proxy forces throughout the region who would immediately retaliate against American interests and allies. An American attack on Iran would likely trigger an Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which would send global oil prices skyrocketing overnight. We'd be looking at massive economic disruption, not just in the Middle East, but worldwide. Supply chains would break down, inflation would spike, stock markets would crash, and that's just the economic consequences. The human cost would be catastrophic. Iran is not some third world country with a barely functional military. It has 88 million people, many of whom would rally to defend their country regardless of how they feel about their government. American casualties would be substantial. Iranian casualties would be astronomical. The entire region would be set ablaze, with conflicts spreading to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and potentially beyond. And here's the thing that really gets me. None of this serves the interests of ordinary Americans. The American people have made it clear through multiple elections that they're tired of endless wars in the Middle East. They're tired of seeing their tax dollars spent on military adventures that don't make them safer. They're tired of watching their sons and daughters come home in coffins or with life-altering injuries, all in service of objectives that are never clearly explained and never seem to be achieved. Yet the foreign policy establishment in Washington, the same people who brought you the Iraq War and the intervention in Libya and the arming of Syrian rebels, are pushing for another war that will be even more costly and even more destabilizing than the ones that came before. You have to ask yourself, who benefits from this? It's certainly not working-class Americans who are struggling with inflation and stagnant wages. It's not small business owners trying to navigate an uncertain economic environment. It's not young people already drowning in student debt who would be called upon to fight this war. The beneficiaries are defense contractors who make billions from military spending. They're oil companies that profit from instability and high energy prices. They're geopolitical strategists who see the Middle East as a chessboard where they can demonstrate American power. They're ideologues who believe that American military dominance must be maintained at all costs, regardless of the consequences. Let me tell you what I think is really happening here, because the surface-level explanations don't hold up to scrutiny. This isn't really about stopping a nuclear weapons program or countering terrorism. This is about preventing the emergence of a multipolar world order where the United States can no longer dictate terms to the rest of the planet. For the past 3 decades, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States has enjoyed unrivaled global dominance. It could invade countries with impunity. It could impose sanctions that crippled economies. It could use the dollar's role as the global reserve currency to control international finance. But that era is ending, whether American policymakers want to accept it or not. China's economy is on track to surpass America's in size. Russia has demonstrated that it can operate independently of Western financial systems and withstand massive sanctions. Countries throughout the global south are increasingly refusing to automatically align with Washington on every issue. They're trading in their own currencies instead of dollars. They're joining alternative international institutions like the BRICS grouping and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're pursuing their own interests rather than serving as junior partners in an American-led order. This is what terrifies the people who run American foreign policy. It's not that Iran poses an existential threat to the United States. It's that Iran's successful resistance to American pressure inspires other countries to pursue independence as well. The provocation we're seeing now is an attempt to reassert dominance, to prove that the United States can still bend recalcitrant nations to its will. It's a dangerous gamble based on the assumption that Russia and China will ultimately back down rather than risk a confrontation with American military power. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if they've decided that this is the moment to draw a line, to make it clear that the era of unchallenged American hegemony is over? What if they're willing to accept significant costs to defend that principle? These are questions that should be keeping policymakers up at night, but instead we get bombastic rhetoric and military posturing that seems designed more for domestic political consumption than strategic coherence. I think about the ordinary people who will pay the price if this escalates into war, the Iranian families who will lose loved ones, the American soldiers who will be sent to fight in a conflict that serves no genuine national security interest, the people throughout the Middle East who will see their countries become battlegrounds once again, the global poor who will face even higher food and energy prices as supply chains collapse. None of these people have any say in the decisions being made in Washington or Tehran or Moscow or Beijing. They're just trying to live their lives, raise their families, and build a better future. But they'll be the ones who suffer the consequences of decisions made by politicians and generals and strategists who will never personally face the horrors of war. What can we do about this? First, we have to reject the manufactured narratives that are designed to sell us on war. When you hear talking heads on television describing Iran as the greatest threat to peace in the Middle East, remember who actually invaded Iraq under false pretenses? Remember who armed rebel groups in Syria that turned out to have ties to Al-Qaeda? Remember who supported the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen that has killed hundreds of thousands of people? The moral posturing is unbearable when you look at the actual track record. Second, we have to demand that our elected representatives explain exactly what strategic objectives would be achieved by war with Iran and at what cost. Make them answer those questions in concrete terms, not vague platitudes about national security and American leadership. Third, we need to push for diplomacy and de-escalation. The diplomatic path is always available if there's genuine will to pursue it. Iran has repeatedly indicated its willingness to negotiate if sanctions are lifted and its sovereignty is respected. That doesn't mean giving Iran everything it wants or pretending there are no legitimate disagreements. It means engaging in good faith discussions to find mutually acceptable solutions, the way countries have resolved conflicts throughout history. But diplomacy requires humility, a willingness to acknowledge that other countries have legitimate interests too, and a recognition that American power has limits. These are qualities that seem to be in short supply among the current generation of foreign policy leaders. We're at a genuinely dangerous moment, perhaps more dangerous than most people realize. The warning signs are all there if you're willing to look beyond the superficial coverage in mainstream media. We have escalating rhetoric, military buildups, economic warfare, and great power competition all happening simultaneously in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The room for miscalculation is enormous. A single incident, a ship attacked in the Persian Gulf, a drone shot down, a missile strike on a military base, could spiral into a wider conflict that nobody really wants, but that becomes inevitable once the machinery of war is set in motion. That's how World War I started, with a series of escalations and automatic responses that the leaders at the time thought they could control but ultimately couldn't. I don't claim to have all the answers here. These are complex issues with legitimate disagreements about the best path forward, but what I can tell you is that rushing headlong into another Middle Eastern war based on the same flawed assumptions and deceptions that led us into Iraq would be catastrophic. We need to slow down, think carefully about the consequences, and listen to voices outside the narrow establishment consensus that has been wrong about virtually every major foreign policy decision of the past quarter century. The stakes are too high to do anything less. This isn't a game. This isn't a movie, this is real life, and the decisions made in the coming weeks and months could determine whether we stumble into a catastrophic war or step back from the brink and choose a different path. That's what's actually at stake here, and that's why you need to be paying attention to every development in this crisis, not just accepting the sanitized version of events that serves the interests of people who have been consistently wrong about everything.